I got a press release about a woman called Mary Elms, who is, to use the shorthand, the Irish Oscar Schindler. With her colleagues, she saved about 400 children and adults from deportation to the Nazi gas chambers. And I had never heard of her.
Clodagh, I was very excited to get you here today.
Snap!
This is going to be a lovely conversation.
We're going to have fun.
Yeah, a little bit different to my normal ones. And I just think that you're such an interesting lady. So tell me why you started writing about the women of Ireland who've been written out of history, really.
I know. You know, I grew up in Kerry and there were women everywhere. My dad and my aunt in particular, but they'd take me down to the beach and they'd say, you know, such and such a goddess, you know, rode the waves. Or Scotia's Glen is a place in County Kerry, and the story goes that this Egyptian princess came to avenge the death of her husband, and she was pregnant and she went into battle and she fell off her horse and died, and this is her grave. That is a story. Now, I don't think, well, maybe it happened and maybe it didn't happen. But I grew up with these stories, and there would be stories of, you know, women who were probably taken as war booty. There would be a little bit of that. But there was women in the war booty, you know, kind of. Cuchulainn had this woman who was up on Caherconree, and she wanted to tell him that the coast was clear and she put milk into the river. She had been taken by Curie MacDara. She put milk in the river to tell Cuchulainn to come and get her, which he did and rescued her. Now, whether he was rescuing her or it was kind of he was taking the war booty away from the other man is kind of a moot point. But in these stories, these women had agency, you know. And I was telling you, my father used to tell us stories of the witch of Carrian, who may or may not be a real person. But, you know, he was a great man for the mountains. And I used to imagine this mischievous witch as she was up at the top. So, you know, and there was a wizard as well, I have to say. But then when I grew up and I became a journalist and I was kind of very interested in stories. And then when I looked around for the stories of the women of our past, they weren't there. And it really came home to me, Laura, in about 2016. I got a press release about a woman called Mary Elms, who is, to use the shorthand, the Irish Oscar Schindler. With her colleagues, she saved about 400 children and adults from deportation to the Nazi gas chambers. And I had never heard of her. So I wrote a column about it for the Irish Examiner. I have to give a shout out to the Irish Examiner. They're great. It's a great place to work and they're always interested in these stories. And as I began to research her, I realised there was a huge archive. So I ended up writing a book about her. And happily, there is now a number of books and there is a bridge called after her in Cork. But that started me on a journey about this woman who had taken off from Cork to work in the Spanish Civil War first. She was an aid worker. She set up hospitals. She went along the coast ahead of Franco. I mean, she must have seen horrendous things. You know, the stories that come from there are, you know, they had we didn't look too closely at the meat. We thought it could be cat meat or whatever. And that's the least of it. She would have seen children being blown to bits, basically. And she took photographs. It's her photographs from that time survive of these children. The women she worked with, they had just a way of creating havens in the middle of wartime. And there's one gorgeous picture of her with a little girl called Palmyra. And Palmyra was blown up in a bomb attack in Malaga and she nearly lost her foot. But Mary Elms and her nurses and doctors said, no, we will try to save her foot. And they saved the foot of this little girl by putting her on a board, but she'd no parents. So eventually her parents did find her. And Mary said, this is a great story. We've actually saved this little girl's foot. So this was in about 1937. And I think of Palmyra, she could still be alive, walking around on 2 feet, thanks to Mary Elms. So she saved a lot of people ever before she ended up in France. And it was such an honour. I interviewed and met several of the people she saved.
Okay.
And I have to tell you one story, because sometimes, Laura, you be doing a piece of work and you think, how did this story come to me? And I think the reason Mary Elms' story came to me was because of a woman called Charlotte Berger. Charlotte Berger was 4.5, and she was due to be deported with her mother. Her father was working outside the camp, and they were waiting for her to turn 5 so they could send her off to be killed. This is from the south of France. How awful is that? Mary Elms and her colleagues spirited her out of the camp in 1942, and she was raised at various children's homes. Her mother was taken off as if she was a parcel in 1942, aged 31. That was all Charlotte ever knew of her mother. She didn't have a photograph of her. She didn't have a piece of writing. I interviewed Charlotte, and then towards the end of the research for the book, I started looking through all the files I had from the Quakers files. And a very nice man, Bernard Wilson, who was a Quaker himself, said, look in this particular folder. And I found Charlotte's mother's last words spoken to her out the window of a train to one of Mary Elms's colleagues. So the Quakers, as these people were being taken to their death, they would stop along the stations and they would say, can we take a message? Can we give you water? Just a bit of human contact. And this woman, Zerl Berger, said, please tell Charlotte Berger, send her my most affectionate thoughts and 1,000 kisses.
Oh, gosh.
I found that and I sent it to Charlotte.
Wow.
80 years afterwards.
Oh, my goodness.
So she came to Ireland for the opening of the bridge, and she said, this is the best message I have ever had, 1,000 kisses.
1,000 kisses from your mother.
Yeah. So I suppose I was very inspired by the lasting legacy of these women who'd been written out of history, and so many others. But it's very tangible. So that's just one of many stories.
Yes, my goodness. And we could talk for ages because there's so many women. So let's talk about, I won't say your favourite few because I'm sure they're all your favourite in a certain way. But tell me about the people that you think that we might be interested in.
Well, I have to have one especially for you because I think she was the original fabulous pharmacist. There's a woman in Cork called Nancy McCarthy, and she qualified in pharmacy in 1926, which would have been one of the first pharmacists in Ireland. And she worked in Cork, but she did something which was very unusual. She set up her own business in Douglas, which is a suburb of Cork. Now, she didn't have Viva la Vulva show, but she was very much an amateur actress.
Okay.
And she knew Cyril Cusack, and she knew Frank O'Connor, and she knew Micheál Mac Liamore, and she was a great woman, a cultural woman who really said, Cork is a cultural wasteland, we need to harvest this. And I came across her, actually, would you believe a woman from New Delhi told me about her? That's another story. But anyway, I was looking her up and I came across a lovely little vignette. You might remember the painter Pauline Buick. Mm-hmm. Pauline Buick was interviewed in the Irish Examiner and she was 52 and she says, when I grow up I want to be like Nancy McCarthy. And at that stage Nancy McCarthy was 84 and she just retired no pressure now, keep going. And she said,
goodness.
this woman is amazing. You know, she runs up and down the stairs of the Opera House. So she really was a powerhouse. And her papers are in Cork. And I hope to go and kind of bring her to life a bit. So I will call her, if you don't mind, the original Fabulous
That's fine.
Pharmacist.
I don't mind. I don't own that title.
Yeah. But I think you'd find a lot of inspiration from her.
Absolutely.
You know?
And the other woman that there was so many women that did work during the wars and didn't get recognised for that. So can we discuss that a little bit?
Well, I suppose through all the wars here and all the various phases of the wars of the revolutionary times, there would be so many women who started their medical career then. There's a couple I think that are very interesting, particularly you might find very interesting, because they started an interest particularly in women's health. There's one woman called Dr. Ella Webb, and she cycled through 1916 gunfire to set up a clinic for the wounded. But she was an early doctor like so many others, and what they did was they set up St. Ultan's in 1919. St. Ultan's Hospital was in Charlemont Street in Dublin, and it was an entirely female staff. You Dr. Lynn, who's very well known, Kathleen Lynn, and there is Dr. Dorothy Stopford Price, who learned German so that she could go around to the European cities to see how they were dealing with TB. And she was the first to bring the BCG vaccine to Ireland. And of course there was trouble because she was Protestant and they wanted to have clinics going around the country, and the priest thought, oh, there's too many Protestant doctors on this. And
I heard about that. I know. Crazy, isn't it?
Crazy. But those women did go around the country and they set up baby clubs and they set up mother and baby clubs. There's one woman I find really inspiring. Her name is Delia Mockler, and she was the first female assistant master at the maternity hospital. And she said it was very regimented how children were raised. And she said love and cuddling is as important as regular feeds. And she used to include men in her classes. And she's really interesting as well because her father was very involved in the Land League and they were evicted. She was evicted as a child, so they were put out on the street. And yet she managed, and I don't know exactly how, to study to be a doctor and to become a very successful doctor. So these women early on in the 1920s and 30s were seeing the issue, they were seeing the difficulties faced by mothers. There's a report in the 1930s called the Carrian Report, and in it they found that girls as young as 13 were becoming pregnant, and sometimes a lot of it was to do with abuse and rape. And they said, we really need to introduce healthcare for these children and also education. And not only did they not include her comments in the report, along with Dr. Dorothy Price, they actually didn't bring out the report at all. But many of the issues that we are talking about now, you'll see as far back as in the 1930s. It's quite frightening. You just wonder if they had listened, it would be a very different country, you know. And this was kind of, as women were being put into institutions, and then there was the institutional schools, it was known what was happening. And a lot of women's organisations said, this is a problem. This is an issue, more an issue than a problem, and it needs to be addressed. And this was before the first constitution came out in 1937. They said, this doesn't reflect the reality in Ireland. We want to talk to Eamon de Valera. They had a huge...
Is this Common Naman?
It's not Common Naman. Common Naman were represented. This was a women's political group.
Okay.
And there were 16 or 19 different organisations in it. There were the women's graduates, there were women for votes, which you would imagine, but the Irish Girl Guides were represented on it, and there was the Irish Housewives Association, there was the Irish Countrywomen's Association. They said, no, we need to address what's going on here, and this constitution it as Margaret Buckley, who was the first president of Sinn Féin, said, "You're treating the women of Ireland like half-wits."
Yeah.
He met them. They did actually the recent article that said, the recent article that we voted to keep in, that was even worse actually in the original one. It said women by their weaker strength shouldn't be allowed work in certain roles. And the reason actually that was there was because there wasn't enough jobs to go around. So it was nothing to do with, I have this great respect for women in the home. It's just there are not enough jobs to go around. And we're introducing legislation which says you can't have more women than men in a place. So that's actually how that article in the Constitution came about. That was the thinking at the time.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it wasn't even anything to do with keeping the women in the home necessarily. It was all to do with the fact that there wasn't enough jobs out there.
Exactly, yeah. And if they had done even a portion of what they had promised to do for women in the homes, we were just saying, if I said I want to stay at home, the standards of housework have fallen desperately because of my economic duty to go out. If you actually tested that in a court and said, fought for it and said, well, the government should pay me to keep home. I mean, that's the next logical step, which would be really radical, But all they did was introduce the children's allowance. Not nothing, but they did, but it wasn't at all, it might have been very different,
Yeah, if these women were listened to instead
absolutely.
of being, cast aside, I suppose, or treated like half-wits, like
half-wits,
that lady said.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would like to speak about the lady who brought contraception to Ireland, because I think that this story isn't known. Now, we all know as Mary Robinson as being a pioneer for contraception here in Ireland, but this other lady was before even Mary Robinson's time, wasn't she?
She was, and I suppose we think of the contraceptive train, in the 1970s when all those amazing women went to Belfast to get condoms. Yes, all that had a huge impact on changing social mores in Ireland. But the woman who changed the law was May McGee. And the reason she did so is because she laughs herself. She says, all my husband has to do is look at me and I get pregnant. So she got married to Seamus McGee in the late 60s. And between 1968 and 1972, they had 4 children under 23 months. It wrecks your head trying to think of it.
Must have been twins, was it?
There were twins. And what happened, her first child, she had an awful lot of medical issues with her first child. It was a very difficult birth. So her doctor, even at the time, was suggesting that maybe it would be a good idea to go on the pill, because the pill wasn't in fact illegal. It was just illegal to sell and distribute it. A doctor could actually, in other words, so you couldn't get your hands on it, but if a doctor said for a medical reason you should be on the pill, then you might do that.
But how could they get it?
You'd have to go through a very friendly doctor,
okay,
or a sympathetic doctor.
Okay.
And also, May was reluctant to take it because the church was so against contraception that it was seen as a very bad thing. So she was unwilling to take it. And then she got pregnant a second time, very soon after her first son, Martin, was born in 1968. And she had a stroke while she was pregnant. She had the child, and then she got shingles. And she said, she's so funny. She said, it was like I'd done 10 rounds with, a boxer. And so she was in an awful state. And then they said, no, you really... So then she said, okay, I'm going to try contraception now. And just as she was about to try it, she got pregnant with twins. So when the twins were born, it was really, her doctor said, it is dangerous for you to get pregnant again. But she could no longer take the pill because it'd be difficult. Yeah. So he suggested a diaphragm and spermicidal jelly. Now, whatever about the pill, any barrier method would endanger those very sacred sperm. So that was really against the Catholic Church. So that was a definite no-no. So you had to send away to England. And the spermicidal jelly came and it was stopped by the customs officers. who could be doing so many other things. So they arrived to her house and she got a notification to say she had contravened the law. And there was, I think, she might have had to pay a fine, or there was even, the threat of jail. But May McGee and her husband were furious. She wasn't going to have it. And at the time, her doctor was very involved in the kind of nascent Family Planning Association. And it was Sean McBride, actually, as a lawyer, was involved. Mary Robinson was around in the background too. And they kind of said, would you not take a legal challenge? So she took it to the High Court, and they took on the Attorney General and the Revenue Commissioners. These ordinary, well, they're really quite extraordinary, but ordinary working people who at the time were living in a mobile home in Lochshinny in North Dublin. And they lost their case. The other thing I should say is May was hard of hearing since she was a girl, so she lip reads. So, I mean, to actually go into a courtroom and to give evidence by lip reading, it's intimidating to the best of us, with all our faculties. And she said they ask you the same question 6 different times, and it was so difficult. But they challenged it and they took it to the Supreme Court. And the judge actually said to Seamus, who's her husband, are you not ashamed for your wife to be taking contraceptive? Do you not think it's terrible that your wife would be taking contraceptives? And he said, I would prefer her to take contraceptives than me bringing flowers to her grave. And it's great that this case is back in the light, because it was 50 years ago last year since they won. But May tells the story. The judge then, she was sitting in the witness box, and the judge, she made a point of looking him straight in the eyes. And one of the barristers said, would you not consider living as brother and sister? And she said, no, I would not. We are man and wife.
Patronising.
Unbelievable. And they won it.
It's almost making the woman out to be dirty or something like that for wanting contraception, isn't it? Like, even just saying that.
I mean,
outrageous.
And to think, outrageous. But she wasn't having it. I mean, she would have been 27, I think, at the time. And the courage, the thing I love about that story is that, and I've met both of them, and Seamus died recently, but you could see the equality in that household. They were a couple in everything. And you could see if the world was built like how they built their own house, it would be a better place, because his right, there was no question of whose rights were what. It's just you had to take all voices into consideration. And she says, you have to stand up for the woman's rights. She really resented the fact that the state was poking its nose into their private business. First of all, the family home, and then they're into their bedroom, that the long arm of the state could have a say in their sacred relationship. And that spurred both of them into action. I just think,
wow.
Versus the Attorney General and the Revenue Commissioners. And they won their case. And it was recently, actually, a lawyer described it the equivalent of landing on the moon in terms of social change in Ireland. Now, it would be many decades before, it was so hard to get condoms, as you know, but 50 years ago, it's all down to her. She changed the law for all of us.
Wow. It's amazing, isn't it?
It really is.
And she's not really well known.
No, she's not.
So with all your research, and we'll talk about more women, why is it that these women aren't known? Why have they not been written into history? Why do we not learn about them in primary school or secondary school? All we learn about is Countess Markievicz.
Oh, it's such a lack of imagination.
I know, isn't it?
And I think the reason we learn about Countess Markievicz is that she's valued because 2 of the things she did, one is she was in the Parliament, even though she didn't take her seat, and the second, she held a gun. She was part of the military. So I think the telling of stories of the past has centred around supposed pinnacles of power, like a parliament or military rulers. And power is far more diffuse than that. And it comes from the ground up. And also, there's that horrible patina of testosterone over the whole lot of it, and this very narrow view. I think actually a lot of men have been written out of history as well. It's, it's the stories of the men at the top. It's very dull. If you look down O'Connell Street and you see Daniel O'Connell, a grand man, but it annoys me incredibly that we know very little about his wife, Mary O'Connell. And do you know anything about Mary O'Connell?
I will have to admit that I absolutely do not.
And it is true, he has a reputation for being a man with a glad eye, which is true. And there's a story that he had many, many women, which apparently he did. But when he met Mary O'Connell from Tralee, this is where I'm from, he reformed his ways and they married, and they were a very successful couple. And she was his confidant, his business advisor. He was a dreadful man to spend too much money, and she would try to organise the estate. And there are letters. They were very much in love. And there are letters between the two of them. That's one project I hope to do, is to bring this woman back and just say, the size of him, when you look down O'Connell Street, and I want to put a cloth over it and say, here she is.
Yeah.
And let's talk about her for a while. Because she had a really hard time, because he was off spending money and, fighting for Catholic emancipation. And she was keeping home and hearth together, and actually had a breakdown and went off to kind of mind herself and came back from that. It's a very interesting story.
Yeah.
So I'll tell you that the next time when I read her letters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's another lady that you write about who's very interesting, who was quite an advocate for people that were, incarcerated in industrial schools.
Oh, Christine Buckley.
Yes.
Oh, Christine is an amazing
Yes.
woman. And I worked with her husband. Well, Christine is one of those more recent women. And she had her own story herself.
I'm jumping from past to present.
Yeah, but they're all around.
Yes.
Everywhere you go, and those stories reach back into
They do,
the past.
and actually that's the interesting thing, because it's almost like the women, when you're talking about them, those women could be alive today.
They really could. It's so modern.
Yeah.
Their concerns were modern. Their relationships were modern. I was just thinking, tomorrow is May Day. And there were so many feisty trade unionists, women trade unionists in Ireland, that are so inspiring. And I'll just tell you about two of them, because there were two women and they were a couple. And there's actually a bench in their memory in Stephen's Green. So I think, just to kind of thread through your question, you asked, why have they been written out of history? Some of them haven't, in that their stories are there, but we need to retell those stories. There is a commemoration of these two women who lived all their lives together, but we've forgotten about it. And also I think we need to change the curriculum in schools, and we need to, one of the things I love to do is I walk around the city. I love stories, and I go, see that now. Look what happened here so many years ago. Or do you see this, this post box? There'll be a story about that. So the story of this, right in the centre of Stephen's Green, there are a number of benches, and you will find Countess Markovich is there as well. But there's a fantastic kind of horseshoe-shaped bench that's enormous, and you'll find people drinking cans there and, out in the sun. And it's dedicated to two women called Louisa Bennett and her partner, Helen Chenevix. And Louisa Bennett set up the Irish Women's Workers' Union with Delia Larkin. Actually, it was Rosie Hackett and Delia Larkin set up this union for women, because they worked in Jacob's Biscuits, and Jacob's Biscuits conditions were so harsh that Jim Larkin said it would send you from this earth 20 years before your time.
How harsh were they, tell me?
Well, very long days, I would say. Well, I don't know exactly. Long days, I would say, I can tell you actually a lot of women worked in laundries at the time, paid laundries. And I have very good detailed description of what their working relationship.
Okay.
So you'd work 13 hours a day. Your feet, you could get trench foot because, your feet would be blistered and you would be sweating the whole time. And and you'd have respiratory problems. I suppose you'd be paid very little. That would be true of Jacob's Biscuits as well, and a lot of the factories at the time. But I want to say, because Jacob's Biscuits, we still eat their biscuits, they became very progressive as time went on, and they introduced fitness classes for their workers. But in the 1910s, there were so many different strikes. There was the lockout of 1913. So you have the beginnings of trade unions, and you have Rosie Hackett and you have Delia Larkin set up this union for women. And this is when my lady Louisa Bennett comes along. She was asked after kind of 1916, will you organise a union for women? And she gave an interview much later in the Sunday press, and she said, I'd no clue how to do it. I'd no furniture, I had no money, I'd no office and no clue. And she said, I got a jotter and a pen and I got the names of 2 women. And they paid me a penny or whatever, and I started. And a few years later, she had 5,000 members. Wow. And I just loved the idea of this woman saying, I don't know how to do it, but I'm going to get a jotter, you join me, and we'll go for it. That idea of comradeship and the community between women of various concerns. So she and her partner Helen Chenevix were incredible women. They were social activists. They wanted children to stay longer in school, or if children had to, and they wanted the parents to be compensated as well. Because if I said to you, Laurie, you stay in school until you're 17, your parents are going to lose out on the money that you would earn if you were out working. Yeah. So they had the foresight to see this is going to lead to hardship in the family. So they fought for that. But the most radical thing they did was the 1945 laundry strike. 1,500 women went out on strike for nearly 3 months. And their slogan was, don't iron while the strike is hot. Isn't that very good?
I love that. This is a paid laundries. It's not the Magdalene laundries.
It's not the Magdalene laundries. No, these were the paid laundries, the ones where they worked for 13 hours a day. Often, you can imagine it would have been a very humid condition.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And they won, and they won 2 weeks paid holidays for all of us. That's why we have 2 weeks paid holidays, because of these 2 women.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was funny because Louis Bennett, the other thing too, you look back and you say, oh, women and women's concerns, but they had lots of different concerns, because Louis Bennett was a trade unionist who said women should stick together. And she travelled all over the world to say, we should have a women's trade unionist. This is how we make progress. And then there was Cissy Cahalan, who was a trade unionist from Cork, and she said, no, we have to join the men. Otherwise, there's no point at all. And she worked in Arnott's and got fired from Arnott's twice for making difficulty. But she got a 30% pay increase for the workers. She was in the Drapers Union. And at the time, women, they'd have men too, they lived above the shop. All those big department stores, and they'd be locked in. So you talk about kind of incarceration. And she campaigned for better conditions for them, but also that they'd be let loose, So,
goodness.
Yeah. I remember hearing you say, all the women that went before us, it's so important to tell their stories, because we think what we're experiencing or that our battles now are new. But they're not at all.
No, we're just building on the battles that our grandmothers and great-grandmothers had, aren't we? And just making it that little bit better for the generation that comes after us.
You would hope so. You would hope so.
Did Louis Bennett and her partner, did they live openly as gay women?
They did. Yeah, they did. And I think, people would say they were lifelong friends. That's what people say.
Yeah.
But there was an understanding, like several of the revolutionary women were in same-sex relationships, and there was an understanding, like Dr. Kathleen Lynn and Madeleine French Mullen, who worked at the St. Ultan's Hospital, lived together, and it was absolutely understood that they were a couple. And when she died, Madeleine died first, people at the funeral said, actually, somebody who was a relative said, "Oh, she was my cousin, but she belonged to you." You know, there was that understanding. And I think
Were
maybe
they more open in those times, and then we became less open, and then now we're more open again? Or was it just that they were high profile women, so it was accepted?
I think it was actually they just turned a blind eye.
Okay.
Yeah, it was like, you know, Micheál Mac Liamore and Hilton Edwards. It was accepted. And it was just the way it was. If they thought, for example, that maybe their own daughter or their own son, that this was, it wasn't really, I can't tell you that it was a wonderful, liberal, open country. In their circles, they were accepted. And it was ignored because it wasn't seen as an issue. So in some ways, ignorance was bliss. But in those relationships, and you can see it's beautiful in her diaries. There's a book of her diaries, Dr. Kathleen Lynn's diaries, by Mary McAuliffe and Harriet Wheelock. And the love and the trust between those two women who spent their waking hours trying to give healthcare to the poor of Dublin. You didn't pay to go into St. Ultan's. It's incredible. It's, you know, and it's just really heartwarming to think that was there, and how they went around the country to try and educate people and to help people. It just shows, there's a long tradition. And I just think if that was better known, we could build on it more and say, oh yeah, that happened before.
But don't you think as well that instead of history books or history lessons in school being factual the way they are, if there was more stories around people, kids would be so much more interested, because it's the storytelling that you're, like, I'm fascinated with what you're telling me, and I'm sure people that are listening are too. Yeah. Whereas when I was learning about, say, the Civil War or the 1916 Rising, like, it was all boom, 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 dates, times, this, that, a few names, not very many stories. But when you take people and you put them into their own situations and they all have characters, it makes it so much more interesting for children.
Couldn't agree with you more. And it's the way it happened. You know, again, I think it's a lack of imagination. You know, how do you pin something down? You say when it happened and who was involved and the date and the time and the man at the top of it, you know.
It's always the man at the top of it, isn't it?
But I'm very interested in voices and kind of in oral histories. And I think there is, thanks to women, a number of women too, there has been a sea change in the way we tell our own stories and the stories of our past. It's kind of this bottom-up story, and it's the story of the experience, what makes us human, you know. And I think you can really reach back through time and see what it was like. It unites us, because I think just to go way back in time, I always wanted to be an archaeologist, actually.
Did you?
I did. And in 1984, when I did my Leaving Cert, my mother said, don't be an archaeologist. There's about 2 jobs in archaeology.
She's probably right.
She was probably right. She said, you can retire into it. So I said, okay, I'll do journalism. Worse. But anyway, when I get a chance, I go off and dig in various places.
Do you?
And the best summer... Bit of digging up dirt, same as journalism, you know, dig up a bit of dirt. I was digging in a site in the south of France where the first, wasn't even yet Homo erectus, but it was the first human was found. And I was in a metre squared for a whole summer. And I was so happy in that metre squared. And I remember finding a stone tool that would be 500,000 years old. We don't have anything as old here. And it was textbook stone tool. So you had this piece of stone and you could see how somebody had worked it with another piece of stone. So this could be used as a stone tool, how it would be used to dig. And I held it in my hand and I understood that person or that individual who lived nearly 500,000 years ago.
Goodness.
And I said to myself, what it is that makes us human does not change that much. And I find that very interesting as a way of looking on the world. if you look for similarities rather than difference, if you look for possibility rather than what we can't do, when you look back, and when I look back through her eyes, I'm interested in what did she do rather than what she couldn't do.
This is the title of your book, isn't it?
It is the title of my book.
So yeah,
Through
explain
her
that, because I
eyes.
do love that. The fact that you're like, what? Because women weren't allowed to do certain things. So you're like, well, what did they do? They may have been unable to do things because of laws and legislation in the Catholic Church, but they did lots.
Lots. You can look back in anger, or you can look back and be curious and go, what about the woman from Louth, Jenny Hodgers, who stowed away on a boat and fought as a soldier in the American Civil War? And she became Albert Cashier. And she was the pluckiest soldier that ever was, and was honoured.
She changed her name to a man's name.
She changed her name to a man's name, fought as a man all her life, and she only got rumbled at the end of her life, at the very end of her life, when she was looking for a pension. And they thought there was fraud involved because there was this two names. And her soldiers he fought with, did not know that she was a man, or that he was. I'm getting caught up in my genders here, because I think she was probably what we would call transgender, because I think that Albert Cashier wanted to be a man, because there'd be other people who other women who dressed as men because that's how they could get on. But Jenny Hodgers lived the life of a man. She could see the limitations as a woman, and he became Albert Cashier.
Okay.
Yeah, and actually he is remembered in a mural now in County Louth. Be quite well known. This often happens in the States. But his fellow soldiers came and said, oh my God, I never knew, but they spoke up for him. And I just think that's so interesting. And what is even interesting is that a priest came to the retirement home. They let him for a long time live as a man, even though they knew that biologically this person had been born a woman. And a priest wrote. They were trying to find his relatives in Louth, and a priest wrote to the paper with great understanding of Jenny Hodgers becoming Albert Cashier. And I just thought that's so interesting.
And did he get his pension in the end?
He did. He got his pension.
His colleagues stood up for him. Is that it? Wow.
That's exactly right. His colleagues said no. He was the pluckiest infantryman of this brigade. Yeah, and he fought. Yeah.
Okay.
It's an amazing story. So they were, thinkers, tailors, soldiers, sailors, to kind of rework the old rhyme. And you look back, and Robert Boyle, you probably know well, Boyle's Law. Could you remember Boyle's Law?
No.
Anyway, but his sister was far more well known than he was, Lady Randa, in his lifetime than he was. And she helped him. She was the one who built the laboratory in the garden. And she was the one that had the circle of philosophers in London. Yeah. And she was actually held up under siege in Athlone Castle. And she'd 4 children. And she had a husband who was useless. And she actually separated from him. And in the 17th century became a single mother and went to London and made her own way.
Okay. And she's not known as much as Boyle.
You see, things are changing now because there's a wonderful biography of her, and then recently, all the Boyle sisters. There was a load of them. There's been a book about her, and there's a real change, and it's fascinating. So it's this idea of possibility and potential, and we're expanding the stories and the possibilities, because if you extend the past, it has an impact on the present as well.
Yeah, of course.
It really does.
So tell me about some other ladies in your book, In Her Eyes.
Well, one who isn't actually in Through Her Eyes, but she's in this one, Her Keys to the City, is a woman, I think there should be a statue to her. Her name is Kathleen O'Rourke. And Kathleen O'Rourke, without Kathleen O'Rourke, we wouldn't be jogging down the street. We wouldn't be going to the gym as we freely do. Because in 1934, when she set up the Irish Women's Health and Beauty League, all the women of Ireland were very interested, But the church was horrified because, first of all, here you had women dressing in shorts and expressing their, physical, out into the public sphere, doing physical exercises.
Okay.
So 1934, she had a huge following. They had a meeting in the Mansion House and 1,000 women turned up, much like your Vive la Vulva. She had the misfortune to be related to Bishop John Charles McQuaid, who would go on to be the Archbishop John Charles McQuaid, who would be instrumental in shutting down so many things. And he insisted they had a beautiful logo, and it was a woman, one of their members, in flight, but she was wearing shorts, and he said, no, you have to wear skirts. So
the skirts,
yeah, I'm telling you, this goes right back to 1934. So they wore, and she said, you have to take the word beauty out of the league as well. It's too racy.
My goodness.
So they did. They didn't care. They said, the most important thing is that we have a mass keep fit woman movement developed by women for women. And she used to have, if you look back through the papers, you'll see ads. They even did demonstrations in Bewley's, and you'd come and you'd stand up on the table and do exercises. Fantastic. And they were in all kinds of places. So then in 1949, she was a gymnast, and they went to what might be called the Olympics of Gymnastics in Sweden. She had an international reputation. She was so well regarded that the Irish team had a place there, but the Irish government wouldn't fund it. So in articles very similar to kind of articles we've seen recently about funding for female sport, there's this fantastic journalist in the Irish press in the 50s called Anne Kelly, and she used to be giving out about various things. I read her things, and she was saying, here is this great honour, and we don't have money. They're all dressed up in green and they've nowhere to go. So they did a fundraiser and they managed to go. And one very interesting thing, one of their gymnasts had an 8-week-old baby, and she didn't know what to do because there was no childcare. So she just took the baby with her. So that's one aspect to Kathleen O'Rourke. And what she's known for, this is ever before she did what was her profession. She was actually a physiotherapist and a remedial physiotherapist. So in 1948 and in 1950, there were polio epidemics. And, women were very involved in trying to help TB, and along came the polio epidemic. And Kathleen O'Rourke said, we have to do something about this. And she set up a therapy centre in her own living room, which was up 3 flights of stairs. So after polio, there was people left with a lot of disabilities. And in the beginning, she used to get parents to bring them up the stairs, and she had her dining room table and she'd blankets, and she would give them physiotherapy. And she started to campaign for a centre for these people. And with Lady Goulding, they set up the Central Remedial Clinic. And she also was one of the first people in Dublin to do antenatal classes, and men would come along and she would make them do the breathing exercises with the women, and the Irish Health League went from strength to strength, and it still exists. It's called the Fitness League Ireland, I think, and they have classes in Dublin and Wicklow. There's about 60 different classes a week,
Okay.
So she broke through the barrier of the idea of women physically exercising in public, because we take that for granted.
We absolutely do.
Don't we?
And I had no idea that we couldn't do that.
It isn't that you couldn't, but you wouldn't. Because there was no precedent, and and all those classes in the gym and, running, but it was very much private sphere. And I suppose, and she and her movement changed that. And I think she's a fantastic woman. She should be recognised.
Absolutely. And then more recent ladies that you would have met and interviewed and who have you met that really struck
well, you were saying Christine Buckley
Yeah, I'd love to
was
talk about her.
just a warrior. She experienced such hardship in her own life, and she became a nurse. And while she was nursing, she realised she met other people. She was in Golden Bridge Orphanage, and she had double difficulty of being mixed race, and being in an orphanage and suffering horrendous abuse, which she spoke about. She was one of the first to speak about it. And she gave a voice to so many others. And what she did was she realised that a lot of the women and men who'd been through those institutions needed help and support in education, in how to function in the world, and, in just how to have confidence in themselves. And I suppose one of the reasons I'm very interested in women's stories myself is that I was born in a mother and baby's home.
Were you?
Yeah, and I really feel for my mother who gave birth in 1967 and felt in 1967, 97% of the children who were born in Ireland were given up for adoption. There was no option. There was no place in this country for a woman who had a child out of wedlock. She was literally put into a place outside of society. So I've been very interested in how people have been pushed. There's no role for them outside of society. That has started to change. But so I'd be very interested in her. And then my mother, that my birth mother would be 80, but my own adopted mother, if she were still alive, she'd kill me for saying this, but she'd be nearly 100. And I look through her experience, and she was 20 years earlier, and she had the experience of being so smart. She should have gone to college. There just wasn't enough money to send everyone to college. So she got married. She did the matric. They said if you do the matric in a 2-year exam in 1 year, you can go to college. And she didn't. I think she came first in Ireland in history or something. But there wasn't the money. So she joined the bank and then got married and moved to Tralee, where she became Mrs. Tom Finn. Her whole identity was gone. And she had to ask my father's permission. She had to get his signature if she wanted to get a book out of the library.
Wow.
Yeah. And you couldn't sign a checkbook. This is my own living lifetime. So I've been very interested in, women's stories and how they negotiate their paths through the world. And then my own experience was it took me a very long time to actually get my own paperwork. I didn't get my birth cert until I was 1943. Until I was 53. 53.
Wow. And were you looking for it?
Yeah, you can't. So the recent, the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Babies Homes, I would say they are the people, they're my heroes of the moment. They are the ones who said, this isn't good enough. We want to tell our stories. And they were put together in a commission and their stories were edited out. You remember in 2020, there was a whole furore about the publication of the Commission into Mother and Babies Homes. It does not tell the story of what happened to the women and children of Ireland. And the government acted on it, and they have done a redress scheme that cuts out 24,000 people. And so there's a huge swathe of voices and stories in Ireland that have not yet been told. And the government is acting on a part of the story. And it's cutting out those voices.
Whose voices are they cutting out? Who are those 24,000? What's the significance of cutting them out?
The significance of the 24,000 they are the people who were boarded out, they are the people like me who did not spend 6 months in a mother and babies institution. So the report focused on 14 mother and baby homes and 4 county homes. It doesn't even, there are hundreds in Ireland. Then they said, nothing to see here, even though if you read what they say, their recommendations are totally at odds with the stories of the women that were told to them. Those stories were shoehorned into a little section. So the recommendations are made on the basis of documents and records that were done by official Ireland, rather than based on the women who lived the experience. So the women who gave evidence, there were 2 different committees. I won't even go into how it was set up. It wasn't clear. One had weight and the other didn't. In other words, you have a report that is this big and there are this much the voices of the women who lived the experience.
So Claude is just, her hands, when she said this big, was like a foot. And when she said the women, it's like really like an inch. So.
Indeed, I forget. See, I can see my face.
I know, that's okay.
Yeah, so it's a fraction of the story. And it's a non-told story in Ireland. And, recently, I tell you who I really admire are the people who fought after the Stardust. Because I remember the Stardust extremely well when it happened in 1981 on Valentine's Day. And it's a real study in whose voice gets heard in Ireland. You were following the news and how wonderful it was that finally unlawful killing. And
after how many years? 43 years.
And if you look at the structures and the institutions in Ireland, they do not serve us. This is why I really feel great sympathy for them and empathy for them, because they used the structures, the legal structures and the political structures, and they were let down again and again. And why is that? Again, it gets back to what do we value and the telling of history. It is the people at the top of the legal institutions, the politicians, often male. So you wonder, the story that came out of the first inquiry was, it must have been arson. It must have been started maliciously, this story. So how did that story take hold? We need another inquiry into this. Is it the idea that these are young people from a relatively working class Dublin, so it couldn't be the businessman who's at fault? It couldn't be the building. I would say, do you know when they go to court and they question all the jurors to see if they have any views or biases? I think we should do the same for judges. I'm not saying about any particular judge. I don't mean to say anything about the judge in this particular inquiry. But the people who make the decisions, what are their ideas? How are they formed? Why do they think what they think? And it's very interesting. They think what they think because they've been fed so many stories by traditional sources, by male-centric, it's white, it's male, and it's powerful. And that's one view of the world, but it's a very dull view of the world, and it cuts off so much. And I think just in terms of telling stories, it's funny because you can get so many interesting stories, but it continues to shape our life, Laura, I think, when you see how those people were treated. And yes, they've got unlawful killing now as a verdict. And I think they said they were very happy with what Simon Harris, his apology. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens now. And I think every single one of us should be alert to what happens now, because it is our institutions and it is the institutions of the state that are on trial. And if it serves the people well, if it serves the people of the Stardust well, it has the potential to serve all of us well. So I think we should all get behind them.
Yeah, we should all be very interested in
Very
it.
interested.
Because I think that there is this sense of, oh, sure, listen, it's not us. And oh, sure, listen, it was 43 years ago. And sure, listen, that could never happen again. But when you see how hard those people had to fight to get that verdict.
When you think of Vicky Phelan, she'd be a person, when you think how she was treated and how the institutions of the state failed her, it's happening all the time. And it happened again and again. The redress scheme opened last month, and that story is not finished. They want to relegate it to the past. So one of the reasons I'm really interested in people's experiences right through time, particularly since the foundation of the state, is to try and hack out a channel between the ordinary person and the person at the top, so that you can have access to the channels of power and so that you can affect change. Because we saw how May McGee did it, you know, but she improved the lives of so many people. So my point is, that's a very roundabout way of saying, if you're not listening to the experience of the people on the ground, you can't make good legislation. You can't run a country well. So as well as being very interesting and very entertaining, the stories of our people, women and men, mostly the women have taken the backseat. It's vital for the future.
Absolutely. Did you ever meet your birth mother?
I did.
Clodagh?
I did.
You?
Yeah, I did.
When and how did that go for you?
I suppose this is a very interesting story as well. I met when I was 26.
Okay.
And I suppose there's no template for that. It's very difficult. It was very heady at the start. And then, there are lots of forces at work. And you've expectations. And so we were in contact for about 10 years. And then we weren't in contact. And I suppose it's very interesting to talk about it because I think one of the things you asked me is, was it, what advice would you give somebody? Was that one of the questions?
One of the last questions I'm going to ask you, which will be coming up soon, actually. But you can answer it now if you'd like.
I'll bring it in because I think one of the most important things in life is to be curious and to be compassionate. And in my own experience of this, people were very compassionate. They were very curious because, it's an interesting thing to have two mothers and two fathers. Actually, I met my father as well.
Did you?
Oh, yes. So suddenly you have a profusion of parents, and that's very difficult for everybody because you've all these unexpected crossed wires and relationships that don't match the norm. So for everybody involved, they had to push themselves a little bit further than they might have, than perhaps was comfortable.
Out of their comfort zone.
Absolutely. Yeah. And they did. And then when it didn't work out, it was challenging, and things broke down. You had to do it all over again. Yeah. So
was your mum very young when she had you?
She was 24.
Okay.
Yeah. 24. A very difficult time though. She had me at a time when 97% of children went. But what was amazing was I met her mother, my grandmother. And my grandmother said to me in her 90s, she said, "You must have thought I was a terrible mother to your mother." And I thought, what an incredible thing to say. She didn't know until she was in her 90s, because the fear that was in this country up until recently, and still is, that you couldn't go home and say you were pregnant by a married man, as it happened. So it was like a double taboo.
Okay.
And the compassion in this woman, she was, I think, 94 or something. And she said, "You must have thought I was terrible." I didn't think she was terrible. But to have that bridging that gap was phenomenal. Do you know, so I got that. It's unbelievable, isn't it?
It is. So can you tell people where they can get your books, please?
Okay. Well, A Time to Risk All, which is the story of Mary Elms, the Irish Oscar Schindler, is published by Gill. Through Her Eyes is also published by Gill. So you'll find them in all the usual outlets. I want to talk to you, a special shout out to this book. This is called Her Keys to the City, and I did it with the Lord Mayor, Alison Gilliland. And it is the story of 80 women who are all known. None of them are with us anymore, but they should have been given the freedom of Dublin, but they weren't. And it's a symbolic recognition of those women.
Can you explain first of all what the Freedom of Dublin is for someone that may not know?
The Freedom of Dublin is a kind of an honour given out by the city to somebody who has done particular work for the city. And it was inaugurated in 1876. And a lot of, the great and the good would be awarded, if you would probably get it, But if you defended the city in a particular way, Mother Teresa, for example, when she came here, got the Freedom of the City.
Okay.
Maureen Potter, the great comedian, got the Freedom of the City. The others were kind of politicians and men. Here's a statistic for you. Since 1876, 83 people got the Freedom of the City. Can you tell me how many women?
I think 7, was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, but only because I only know that because I read your a little extract from.
Yeah, and 3 of those are very recently.
Yes.
So when Alison Gilliland took over as mayor in 2022, she wanted to take a big sweep and give 80 women the freedom of the city. But they have to be alive.
Okay.
So she didn't want to do that. But she wanted to redress the balance. So she came up with, I think it's a fantastic idea, to start at the very beginning and go right back and right through history. It starts with Anne Devlin and it goes right up to an amazing woman I wish I had met called Gemma Redmond, who died actually in 2016. She was a biotechnologist who 3D printed living human cells. That kind of hurts my head to even think of it.
I know.
But she was the first person in the world to do that. And she was from Tala. So there's 80 women in here and it's beautifully, beautifully designed by Mark Dignam. And many of the women we spoke about are in this. It's published by Four Courts Press and there's a special offer on at the moment, she says, doing her
that's fine. A little bit of publicity.
Listen,
this is what we're here for, 100%.
It's $7.99. It normally is €20. And if you go on fourcourtspress.com, very easy to pick, you can get a book for $7.99. So that's
and it's a lovely present to give. Actually, do you know what this is? A lovely present to give another woman in your life or a little girl.
Yeah, absolutely.
Boys as well, but I think little girls would be very interested.
Here are all the women who walked this way before us 100%. And, who made the world what it is and take up the fight, continue to fight,
100%.
And there'll be a whole load more women coming in the new book, which is called The Irish in the Resistance. And I've written that with John Morgan. That's also Gill Books and it'll come out in September. Do you want a sneak preview?
Yes.
Yes. So one of my favourite women from that is a woman called Maureen Patricia O'Sullivan, or Maureen Paddy O'Sullivan, as she was known. From Dublin, she was a special agent and she parachuted into enemy France in 1943.
She sounds like my type of chick.
Oh, I'm telling you. Listen, you haven't heard anything yet. So she lands, and as she lands, she feels something in her neck. And her first thought is, oh God, I've died. And then she passes out. She thinks, oh, I've broken my neck. And she passes out. And then she comes to and she can feel breath on her face. And she goes, oh no, I've been rumbled. And she opens an eye and she's in a field in Normandy and there's a cow looking at her. She's not where she's supposed to be, but she's not far away. And what saves her is her backpack is full of French francs to bring to the resistance.
I thought you were going to say French bread.
Well, she had cigarettes and she brought all kinds of things. So she joins the resistance. They're disgusted when they see it's a woman. What? You sent us a woman? And the other thing was she couldn't ride a bicycle, which was absolutely, you had to be able to ride a bicycle because that was the mode of transport. So she could transmit, she had a secret radio set, but she wasn't able to ride a bicycle. So when her superior sees her, he wants to send her straight home. And she says, I'm here now, so you're stuck with me. And he trains her and she goes on to be one of the best radio operators in France, staying there for 7 months when your life expectancy as a secret radio transmitter was like 6 weeks.
Goodness me. That is a sneak preview, all right. When is that book coming out?
Soon, September.
Wonderful.
September. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm going to get it on. I'm going to pre-order it.
Yeah.
Clodagh, you already answered. What piece of advice would you give to young people? So, what do you think the meaning of life is?
Oh, my beautiful dad had a brain tumor, and he died of a brain cancer. So in the days before he died, he'd sort of go in and out, and it affected his speech. But a few days before he died, it seemed to me like a revelation. He said something like, white walls, rafters, and I felt he was in a church. And then he said, and this is what I think the meaning of life is, he said to me, it seems to me we are all one. And we're all connected in this world. And I think our challenge in life is to walk each other home and to get the connectedness between us and to learn. Like people would always say, your parents would say, I just want you to be happy, and you're not going to be happy all the time. If you're happy, I don't know, 25% of the time, that's wonderful. You have all these other kind of uncomfortable emotions the rest of the time. Maybe some are more comfortable, but a whole range. And I think the challenge is to learn to live with them and to see them in others and help the other through. That's what I think.
I love it. Clodagh Finn, author, journalist, female extraordinaire. It has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on the pod.
Fantastic.